The shift didn't announce itself. That was the first warning sign. After episode 5, nothing in the system visibly changed. No new protocols. No sudden restrictions. No conversations that felt corrective. Instead, there was a subtle recalibration in how people responded to me. Not avoidance. Not resistance. Something more refined. A quiet reassessment of my usefulness. I realized then that the system had moved into a different phase. It no longer needed to manage the past. It needed to manage me. Remembering had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer tolerated as a private burden. It had become a liability that needed containment. I noticed it in meetings where my input was acknowledged but never followed. In briefings where conclusions were already framed before I spoke. My presence remained welcome, but increasingly ornamental. That's how systems neutralize without confrontation. They don't silence you. They surround your voice with noise until it blends into irrelevance. I tested this deliberately. I referenced a detail from episode 5 indirectly. Not accusatory. Just observational. The room went still for half a second too long. Then the conversation resumed, adjusted slightly away from the topic. No one challenged me. No one agreed either. Consensus reformed without me. That's when I understood the escalation. Before, memory was inconvenient. Now it was contagious. The system wasn't afraid of truth. It was afraid of propagation. I began seeing subtle barriers appear where none had existed. Access that required additional justification. Requests routed through intermediaries who filtered tone as much as content. Even casual conversations became shorter, safer. People were calibrating around me instinctively. No instructions were necessary. The system had signaled enough. I thought back to the witness from episode 5. He'd retreated into routine not because he forgot, but because remembering had exhausted its utility. That was the model now being applied to me. Endurance until disengagement. I asked myself a question I'd avoided until then. What happens when remembering stops being neutral and starts being tracked? The answer arrived quietly. You stop being an observer and become a variable. Variables don't get erased. They get stabilized. I realized then that episode 6 wouldn't be about uncovering anything new. It would be about surviving the consequences of having already uncovered too much. The system wasn't closing in aggressively. It was giving me space. And space, when strategically granted, is how attention dissipates. I decided then to stop pushing forward and start watching sideways. To observe not what the system said or did, but how it redistributed risk. Who was allowed to remember openly? Who learned to translate memory into abstraction? Who chose silence and was rewarded for it? Episode 6 began not with a discovery, but with an adjustment. The moment I understood that remembering was no longer just a burden. It was a position. And positions, once identified, come with expectations you're never asked to accept explicitly. I started noticing it in the people who survived the longest. Not the ones who rose quickly or burned out spectacularly, but the ones who remained. They had learned something the system never taught directly. A way of remembering without appearing to remember. Selective memory wasn't denial. It was filtration. They retained details internally but released only abstractions outward. They could reference outcomes without tracing paths. They could acknowledge effects without naming causes. That skill wasn't accidental. It was adaptive. And it was rewarded quietly. I watched it happen in conversations that used to feel candid. A colleague would begin a sentence with specificity, then pause, recalibrate, and finish with something safely generalized. The pause mattered more than the words. It was the moment memory was assessed for risk before being allowed into speech. That's when I understood that remembering had become performative. Not whether you remembered, but how you remembered determined whether you remained functional. The system didn't punish memory. It shaped its expression. I tested this deliberately. I recounted a detail from the past in 2 different ways to 2 different audiences. Once with precision. Once with ambiguity. The reactions diverged immediately. Precision caused discomfort. Ambiguity passed unnoticed. That wasn't censorship. That was preference. Systems develop preferences long before they codify rules. People learn them intuitively if they want to stay. I realized then that memory here wasn't binary. It existed on a gradient. At one end, raw recollection, dangerous, isolating, destabilizing. At the other, processed memory, safe, compatible, forgettable. Most people lived somewhere in the middle, constantly adjusting their position based on context. That adjustment required effort. The ones who mastered it looked calm. They weren't. They were constantly translating themselves. Translation costs energy. Over time, it changes what you choose to remember at all. I began noticing gaps forming in my own recall. Not because I forgot, but because certain memories stopped presenting themselves automatically. They waited for permission. That scared me more than erasure ever could. It meant the system didn't need to remove memory externally. It was teaching me to manage it internally. That's the most efficient form of control. I watched a senior figure navigate a sensitive discussion with flawless restraint. He acknowledged past failures without anchoring them to anyone. He referenced lessons learned without specifying what had necessitated them. Everyone nodded. The conversation moved forward cleanly. Afterward, someone praised his leadership. That praise wasn't about integrity. It was about containment. He had demonstrated perfect compatibility. I asked him later how he'd learned to speak that way. He smiled faintly and said, "You stop trying to be understood. You focus on being acceptable." That sentence stayed with me. Acceptability had replaced truth as the governing metric. Truth was tolerated only insofar as it didn't disrupt flow. I thought again of the person removed in episode 5. He hadn't lacked intelligence or restraint. He'd lacked timing. He'd spoken before selective memory became a shared skill. That made him incompatible. The system corrected that incompatibility early, cleanly, and without resentment. Watching this, I realized episode 6 wasn't about resistance anymore. It was about choice under constraint. You could remember fully and accept marginalization. Or you could remember selectively and remain integrated. Both came with costs. Full memory isolated you. Selective memory hollowed you out slowly. There was no third option. I noticed newer staff adopting selective memory faster than older ones. They hadn't lived through enough continuity to feel the loss. For them, ambiguity was normal. That's how cultures shift. Not through enforcement, but through replacement. I felt the pressure to adapt intensify subtly. Not through threat, but through example. Watching who thrived. Watching who remained invited into meaningful spaces. Watching who spoke freely and who was listened to. The lesson was clear. Memory, when unmanaged, marked you. Managed memory kept you useful. I began experimenting with silence. Not withdrawal, but precision. Speaking only when abstraction sufficed. Letting details remain unspoken. It worked. Doors stayed open. Access remained intact. That frightened me more than exclusion ever had. It meant I could survive here by becoming less exact. By sanding down the edges of what I knew until it fit. I understood then that selective memory wasn't just a skill. It was a filter that determined who got to shape the future. Those who remembered too clearly were left behind, carrying continuity no one asked for. Those who remembered just enough moved forward, unburdened by detail. Episode 6 was making its central demand explicit. Not whether I would forget, but whether I would learn to forget correctly. And that question wouldn't wait much longer for an answer. The realization came gradually, then all at once. Remembering wasn't the problem. Speaking was. Memory itself remained largely unpoliced. People carried it quietly, privately, the way they carried doubts or fatigue. But the moment memory crossed into articulation, it entered a different jurisdiction. That's where hierarchy asserted itself. I began noticing who was allowed to remember publicly and who wasn't. Not by title alone, but by perceived stability. Those whose positions were considered essential could afford a wider range of expression. Their memories were framed as insight, context, experience. The same words spoken by someone less anchored were labeled distraction or negativity. I watched a junior analyst reference a past decision during a meeting, gently, without accusation. The room tightened. The comment wasn't incorrect. It was premature. The response came not as correction, but as redirection. That's not helpful right now. Helpfulness had become the gatekeeper. If memory didn't serve immediate momentum, it was excluded. I saw a senior counterpart make a similar reference days later. The tone was reflective, the timing perfect. Heads nodded. The memory was accepted because it arrived with authority and restraint. That's when it became clear. Memory here wasn't democratic. It was positional. I tested this by observing meetings without participating. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain people could speak about the past without consequences. Others learned to reference it indirectly or not at all. This wasn't favoritism. It was risk management. The system allocated expressive memory to those least likely to destabilize it. Public remembrance wasn't about truth. It was about containment. I realized then that silence wasn't evenly distributed either. Some people were quiet because they chose to be. Others because they'd learned what happened when they weren't. Silence itself had a hierarchy. I thought back to episode 5, to the person who'd been removed before becoming a problem. He'd spoken too clearly, too early, without positional insulation. He hadn't understood that memory needed sponsorship to survive out loud. I watched how newer employees adapted. They rarely referenced the past directly. They spoke in hypotheticals, trends, generalizations. The past existed only as abstraction. That wasn't ignorance. It was training. Training that didn't require a trainer. The environment did the work. I noticed my own internal negotiations intensify. I'd think of something relevant, then immediately assess whether I was allowed to remember it publicly. That assessment happened faster each time. Eventually, it felt automatic. That's when I knew something important had shifted. The question wasn't, "Is this true?" anymore. It was, "Is this mine to say?" Ownership had replaced accuracy as the governing principle. I observed a moment where someone violated this rule without realizing it. A mid-level manager referenced an earlier warning that had been ignored. The warning wasn't controversial. What followed was. The discussion moved on, but afterward, his access changed subtly. Fewer invitations. Less visibility. No explanation. He hadn't been punished. He'd been deprioritized. That's the cost of unauthorized memory. I understood then that remembering out loud was treated like power. Not everyone could wield it safely. Power without authorization invites correction. I felt the weight of that understanding settle into something colder. Episode 6 wasn't about whether the system allowed memory. It clearly did. It was about who controlled its circulation. Who could shape narrative by choosing which parts of the past were speakable. The rest of us were expected to carry memory quietly, responsibly, without letting it interfere with progress. I realized then that this wasn't accidental drift. It was governance by tone. The system didn't need to decide what was true. It needed to decide who was credible. Credibility determined whether memory survived exposure. I began to see the outline of the next pressure point. Someone would eventually test the boundary openly. Someone would speak without sponsorship, without abstraction, without permission. And when that happened, the response wouldn't be dramatic. It would be administrative. Procedural. Clean. Episode 6 was no longer theoretical. It was approaching its first visible consequence. And I had a growing suspicion that when that moment came, it wouldn't be me who triggered it. It would be someone watching me closely enough to learn where the edges were. It wasn't announced as a mistake. That was the first thing everyone noticed. When he spoke, no one interrupted him. No one corrected his tone. No one challenged the accuracy of what he said. He wasn't reckless. He was careful, measured, even restrained. That was what made it dangerous. He spoke first, but not loudly. He referenced the past without abstraction. He named a sequence of decisions that had led to the present configuration and asked a question that didn't accuse anyone, but refused to skip over causality. The room absorbed it in silence. Silence isn't agreement, but it isn't rejection either. It's evaluation. I watched faces around the table recalibrate. Not emotionally. Strategically. The conversation resumed shortly after, redirected toward logistics, as if nothing had happened. That's how the system acknowledges a breach without escalating it. No confrontation. No denial. Just a quiet note taken somewhere no one can see. The consequences didn't arrive immediately. They never do. Immediate consequences look like punishment. This wasn't punishment. This was correction. Over the next week, his calendar changed. Not drastically. A meeting moved. A briefing reassigned. A request delayed without explanation. Each change was defensible on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that only someone paying attention would notice. That's how the system keeps itself blameless. It never acts decisively enough to be accused. It distributes consequence across time until intent becomes impossible to prove. I checked whether anyone spoke to him about it. No one had. That was deliberate. Warnings create memory. Memory invites resistance. The system prefers attrition. I watched him adjust slowly. At first, he assumed coincidence. Then miscommunication. Then timing. He recalibrated his behavior without being told to. That's the moment correction becomes internal. The system doesn't need to enforce compliance once the individual starts managing their own risk. I saw it in how he spoke afterward. Still competent. Still articulate. But the edges were gone. He stopped naming sequences. He focused on outcomes. He learned the same skill others had, selective recall. It took less than 2 weeks. That speed was the most unsettling part. It meant the lesson was already there, waiting to be activated. I realized then that speaking first isn't punished because it's wrong. It's corrected because it creates precedent. Precedent invites replication. The system doesn't fear one voice. It fears a pattern. So it neutralizes the first instance gently enough that no one else feels compelled to follow. I noticed others watching him closely. Not with sympathy. With calculation. They learned without being instructed. That's how governance scales. I asked myself whether he regretted it. I never asked him directly. People rarely regret speaking. They regret misjudging the environment. That's a subtler pain. He hadn't misjudged truth. He'd misjudged tolerance. The system's tolerance for unsponsored memory had been lower than he thought. I realized then that episode 6 wasn't about remembering or forgetting anymore. It was about timing. Who spoke when? Who waited? Who watched someone else take the risk first and learned from the outcome? Timing determined survival here more than accuracy ever could. I felt the pressure shift toward me then. Not externally. Internally. I knew more than he had. I'd seen the pattern longer. If I spoke first now, it wouldn't be ignorance. It would be defiance. And defiance invites a different response. Not correction. Replacement. The system distinguishes between naive breaches and informed ones. One gets softened. The other gets isolated. I understood then why episode 5's person had been removed early. He hadn't just spoken. He'd spoken with foresight. He'd skipped the learning phase. That made him irredeemable. Watching this unfold, I realized the true cost of speaking first. You don't just pay for what you say. You pay for what others might say if you make it safe. The system cannot allow that. So it makes examples without naming them as such. Quiet enough that no one protests. Clear enough that everyone understands. I felt the line drawing itself closer. Not because I wanted to cross it, but because eventually, observation itself becomes a form of participation. Episode 6 was approaching the moment where watching would no longer be neutral. Where knowing how the system responds would force a decision, adapt completely, or accept the cost of no longer being correctable. The system is patient, but it isn't infinite. Correction works only as long as there's something left to adjust. Tone. Access. Timing. Once those levers stop producing results, the system has to decide whether the anomaly can still be integrated, or whether it needs to be contained differently. I realized we had reached that point when the usual signals failed. There were no calendar shifts. No subtle rerouting of requests. No gentle narrowing of relevance. Everything remained outwardly unchanged. That absence of response wasn't tolerance. It was escalation. The system had stopped correcting because correction no longer worked. I watched the person who had spoken first stabilize into selective memory, exactly as expected. That path was predictable. What wasn't predictable was the emergence of someone else who didn't adapt at all. He didn't push. He didn't speak out. He didn't test boundaries. He simply continued operating as if the rules hadn't shifted. That was the problem. Systems can correct resistance. They can absorb compliance. But indifference to correction creates noise that can't be dampened. He wasn't confrontational. He wasn't defiant. He was consistent. Consistency without calibration is dangerous. It suggests a different internal metric, one not aligned with the system's preferences. I noticed how people reacted to him. Not with concern. With uncertainty. They didn't know how to place him. He didn't seek permission to remember out loud, but he didn't broadcast memory either. He referenced the past when relevant, without emphasis, without apology. His tone didn't ask for validation. That made it difficult to redirect. You can't soften something that isn't sharp. I realized then that the system's issue wasn't memory itself. It was unmanageable memory. Memory that didn't self-regulate. That didn't seek abstraction or sponsorship. Memory that behaved as if continuity were normal. That kind of behavior creates friction because it exposes how much effort everyone else is expending to appear aligned. I watched the system attempt minor adjustments around him. Invitations reframed. Responsibilities redistributed. Nothing worked. He adapted without changing. That's the point where correction fails. When the subject absorbs pressure without internalizing it. I began to see the next layer forming. Not removal. Not yet. First comes isolation. Not overt. Functional. He was still present, but increasingly peripheral. His contributions weren't dismissed, they were sidelined. That's the system's last attempt to regain control without admitting failure. I understood then why this phase was rare. Most people correct themselves long before this. The system doesn't often need to escalate beyond subtlety. But when it does, the response is precise. I felt the pressure shift toward me again. I recognized the pattern now. I knew what came next. The question was whether I would be grouped with him or used as contrast. Systems like contrasts. They make containment easier. I noticed how often my name appeared alongside his in conversations framed around context or continuity. That wasn't coincidence. The system was mapping association. Deciding whether this was an isolated anomaly or a cluster. Clusters are harder to manage. I adjusted nothing. Not out of defiance, but because adjustment would signal readiness to be corrected. I needed to see what happened when correction truly failed. That choice carried weight. It meant accepting that the next response wouldn't be gentle. The system had exhausted its preference for adaptation. When correction stops working, something else replaces it. Not force. Not punishment. Reclassification. The anomaly becomes something to be managed structurally rather than behaviorally. I saw the signs begin to emerge. Language changed subtly. We were no longer described in terms of role or contribution, but in terms of fit. Fit is a dangerous word. It implies permanence. You don't correct fit. You redesign around it, or you remove it from the equation entirely. Episode 6 had crossed into its final phase. The system wasn't trying to change behavior anymore. It was deciding where memory belonged in the future configuration. And once systems start planning for the future without you, presence becomes provisional. I knew then that the last part of this episode wouldn't involve confrontation. It would involve transition. Someone would be moved. Not visibly, but decisively. And when that happened, the system would resume its calm. Because calm is always the proof that correction has succeeded, even when what it corrected was the possibility of remembering at all. When it happened, there was no announcement. No message. No meeting called to acknowledge the shift. That was the point. Removal creates memory. Reclassification dissolves it. I noticed it first in language. Not spoken language, but written summaries. Documents where names were still present, but functions had changed. Roles redefined so subtly that no single line could be challenged. He wasn't gone. He was still listed. Still reachable. Still nominally involved. But the category had changed. He had been moved from contributor to reference. From active node to background context. That distinction matters. Contributors shape direction. References explain history. You don't consult references when deciding what comes next. You archive them mentally and move on. The system hadn't erased him because erasure would have raised questions. It had repositioned him somewhere harmless. Somewhere memory could exist without influence. That's the most elegant solution. I watched how others responded. Not with alarm. With relief. The anomaly had been resolved. The friction reduced. Conversations flowed again without hesitation. That's how you know the system has succeeded. Comfort returns quickly. People stop monitoring their own tone. That comfort was the signal. I checked his access next. Still intact, technically. But functionally narrowed. He could see outcomes, not deliberations. Summaries, not discussions. That's the difference between participation and observation. Observation feels like involvement until you realize nothing you observe can be changed. I wondered whether he noticed. Of course he did. Reclassification is felt immediately by the person it affects. The difference is whether it can be articulated. He couldn't accuse anyone of removal because nothing had been removed. He couldn't point to a violation because everything complied with protocol. That's what makes reclassification irreversible. There's no lever to pull back. No error to correct. It's a design decision disguised as maintenance. I thought back to episode 5, to the person removed before the case began. That had been a cruder method. Faster. Less refined. Episode 6 showed how much the system had learned since then. It no longer needed to eliminate memory. It could house it safely where it wouldn't interfere. I noticed something else then. The reclassification didn't just apply to him. It adjusted the environment around him. People recalibrated their interactions instinctively. They still spoke to him respectfully. They still listened. But they no longer waited for his input. Waiting is how influence manifests. Without it, speech becomes decorative. I realized then that this wasn't about punishment or control. It was about optimization. The system had decided where memory could exist without slowing momentum. It had found a way to preserve continuity as artifact, not as guide. That's when I understood the risk I now represented. I hadn't been reclassified yet. I was still adjacent to influence. But I had seen the mechanism clearly. That knowledge itself made me unstable. Systems tolerate instability only until it becomes legible. Once legible, it must be addressed. I began to see subtle markers appear around me as well. Invitations phrased differently. Expectations softened. My contributions framed as perspective rather than direction. Perspective is safe. Direction is dangerous. I understood then that reclassification doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, layered, adaptive. You wake up one day and realize you're being listened to, but no longer followed. That's when you know it's almost complete. I asked myself whether resistance was still possible at this stage. The answer was no, not in any direct sense. Resistance requires a point of pressure. Reclassification removes pressure by redistributing relevance. You don't fight it. You fade inside it. That's why it's so effective. I saw how calm returned after the shift. Meetings shorter. Decisions faster. The system had shed weight. Memory had been neutralized without being destroyed. From the outside, everything looked healthier. That's the most dangerous moment. When a system appears stable after removing what challenged it. I realized then that episode 6 wasn't moving toward a dramatic ending. It was moving toward normalization. And normalization is the final stage of correction. Once normalized, the change disappears into routine. People stop noticing what's missing because the absence no longer disrupts flow. I understood what would come next. The final part wouldn't involve him anymore. Or even me, directly. It would involve the system reflecting on itself, quietly validating its own evolution. And once that validation occurred, memory would no longer be a liability. It would be an artifact. Safe. Contained. And entirely optional. Nothing announced the end. That was the clearest sign it had arrived. There was no moment of closure, no acknowledgement that anything significant had changed. The system didn't need one. It had already absorbed the adjustment into routine. Meetings ran on time. Decisions flowed without hesitation. Language stabilized. The tension that had once lingered in pauses and recalibrations dissolved into efficiency. From the outside, everything looked healthier. That's how normalization works. It doesn't erase memory. It makes memory unnecessary. I watched how quickly people adapted to the new configuration. Not consciously. Comfort returned, and with it, forgetfulness, not the forgetting of facts, but the forgetting of discomfort. Discomfort is what keeps memory alive. Without it, continuity fades quietly. The reclassified individual remained present, still respected, still consulted occasionally. But his presence no longer altered trajectories. He had become context. And context is safe because it doesn't argue. I noticed how often his name appeared in summaries framed as background rather than influence. That framing mattered. It told everyone what to do with the memory without instructing them directly. I realized then that normalization isn't passive. It's active maintenance of calm. The system continually reinforced the new equilibrium by rewarding those who moved easily within it. Invitations flowed toward those who didn't slow momentum. Praise followed adaptability, not accuracy. Over time, this reshaped what people valued in themselves. The ability to move forward mattered more than the ability to remember precisely how they'd arrived there. I examined my own position honestly. I was still present. Still speaking. Still technically involved. But I felt the shift. My observations were welcomed as texture, not as guidance. Texture adds depth without altering structure. That's the final stage of reclassification. You're allowed to exist as long as you don't interfere. I asked myself whether anything had been lost if no one felt its absence. The answer was uncomfortable. Loss doesn't require awareness to be real. It only requires displacement. The past had been displaced from relevance. Not denied. Not destroyed. Just set aside where it couldn't complicate the future. I thought again of episode 5, of the room that had held memory longer than people could. I suspected it would be repurposed soon. Not erased. Redesigned. Spaces that no longer create friction are easy to reuse. That's how systems move forward without looking back. I understood then that this wasn't a failure of ethics or courage. It was a function of scale. Systems at this level can't afford memory that resists optimization. They require histories that justify outcomes, not ones that question them. Normalization ensures that only compatible memories survive exposure. The rest fade quietly, carried privately by those who still feel them. I noticed how rarely anyone referenced the earlier tension now. Not because it had been resolved, but because resolution was no longer required. The system had validated itself through stability. Stability is persuasive. It convinces people that whatever came before was either unnecessary or inevitable. Once inevitability takes hold, responsibility dissolves. I considered whether staying mattered if nothing could be changed. The answer came without drama. Staying mattered not because it altered outcomes, but because it preserved the knowledge that outcomes weren't natural. That knowledge doesn't disrupt systems immediately. It lingers. It waits. And sometimes, long after normalization feels complete, it reappears where it isn't expected. I didn't challenge the calm. Challenging it would have restored tension, and tension would have invited another correction. Instead, I remained attentive. Watching how the system spoke about itself. How it framed its own evolution as progress. How it treated memory as optional, useful only when it reinforced direction. Episode 6 ended not with a confrontation, but with an understanding. Normalization isn't peace. It's agreement to stop asking certain questions because asking them no longer feels productive. Once that agreement settles in, systems no longer need to correct behavior. They've already corrected expectation. I carried that understanding quietly. Not as opposition. As awareness. Because awareness doesn't slow systems down immediately. It simply refuses to confuse efficiency with truth. And sometimes, much later, when a system faces something it can't normalize, that distinction becomes the only thing that still matters.